Well, welcome back to this second half of this 12-week course. I hope you've appreciated the first half on, who was that first guy? T.S. Eliot and Joseph Pearce on Evelyn Waugh. If you have not watched the ITV version of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, it's really worth having a look. It's excellent. My little claim to fame is that I actually was in Oxford while it was being filmed. So it came out in 1981. I was there from 1979 to 1982 or something like that. And I can remember walking through the center of Oxford and seeing these two handsome young actors come. They're obviously set up to do a film shoot, and they came walking out of one of the colleges and got into a car and drove off. I thought, oh, I just watched a movie being made. And it was only years later that I realized what movie it was, because I saw that same scene when it came up in Brideshead Revisited. So C.S. Lewis is born in 1898 in Northern Ireland. And to get a little bit of context about his background, you need to know a little bit about the history of Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland. Ireland, from the time of Henry VIII, had been in conflict with England because England was trying to conquer Ireland and take over. They did not succeed. They especially tried to impose the Protestant faith on Ireland, and they did not succeed. The Irish were much more stubborn and resistant in maintaining their Catholic faith than the English were during the English Reformation. So one of the things which the English tried to do was they thought, we're going to import some people from Scotland who are Presbyterians and who are very strict anti-Catholics, and we're going to bring them into Ireland and help them to convert the Irish. Bad idea. So these Scottish Presbyterians were moved into the northern part of Ireland, and they set up their churches, and they owned land. The English gave them land, and therefore Northern Ireland was Protestant and Presbyterian, settled by rough and tumble, tough Scottish people, and Southern Ireland remained Catholic. And thus the clash between the two cultures and the clash between the two religions. And so they were at each other's throats and still are. C.S. Lewis is born in Ulster in Northern Ireland, and therefore is part of the Scottish, Presbyterian, Protestant culture there in Northern Ireland. And we're going to see that this actually influences the rest of his life and the rest of his faith, because this tough Protestant background that he had was really in his bloodstream. And if you want to understand why C.S. Lewis never became a Catholic, you need to understand that he actually was from Ulster, from Northern Ireland, and had this very strong Protestant background in his bloodstream, even though later in his life he was much more tolerant and open-minded towards Catholicism. He still had this deep prejudice against Catholicism. And one of the writers about this has made a pun and said C.S. Lewis's problem was that he had an ulterior motive. And that's why he didn't become a Catholic. Joseph has actually written an excellent book on this topic, which we may have a copy of it back there, which is C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church. And he explains about C.S. Lewis's religion and why C.S. Lewis never, and what his attitudes were to the Catholic Church, and why he never actually became a Catholic, even though his very good friend J.R.R. Tolkien was, of course, a very devout and very committed Catholic. So he's born in 1898 in Ulster in this ultra-Protestant background. His father is a solicitor, or in other words, a lawyer. And so he's middle class, upper middle class. He has an older brother named Warren or Warney. Their father is a distant and emotionally withdrawn person. He doesn't communicate well with his sons. He doesn't relate well with them. And by 1908, when the boys lose their mother to cancer. And so C.S. Lewis and his brother both are bereaved and losing their mother to cancer by 1908. And this only makes their father more withdrawn into his grief and it's his time of bereavement. And so the only way he can deal with his boys is he sends them off to boarding school. And C.S. Lewis goes to a boarding school in England and travels across the North Sea from Northern Ireland to England to attend this boarding school, which was run in retrospect by a psychopath, a man who was cruel, who used to beat the boys, who fed them hardly anything. And if you hear stories about British boarding schools, and there's some pretty bad horror stories coming from English boarding schools, and C.S. Lewis was sent to one of the worst, run by a cruel psychopath who would beat the boys, and eventually, after a year or two, the school went out of business, and C.S. Lewis comes home, and he's privately homeschooled for a couple of years, and then he's sent back across the North Sea to England to attend Malvern School. Now, Malvern School is a much larger boarding school for older boys. Basically, we're talking about boys who are probably 8 years old up to 16, 17 years old, getting ready to go to college. But Malvern School is also a place of bullying and hardship, and C.S. Lewis hates it. But while he's there, he also describes in his autobiography, which is called Surprised by Joy, he describes how he had to go to chapel with all of the other boys, and how the chaplains at the school and the priests at the school were basically English middle-class, respectable people who taught the boys that religion was all about behaving yourselves and being respectable. And C.S. Lewis didn't buy into it even then. So he begins dabbling in the occult and begins getting interested in occult religion, and dabbling in the dark arts and so forth, even as a schoolboy, and also declares himself to be an atheist. By this time, he's in his early teen years. So after Malvern School, his father and his teachers realize that he's quite gifted, but also he's very unhappy in school. So his father sends him to a private tutor in England who prepares C.S. Lewis to take the examinations to get into Oxford or Cambridge. So it's there that his very superior intellect is fine-tuned by this tutor, so he begins to think very rationally and very logically. He begins to express himself very logically and very rationally, and he takes his exams to enter into Oxford, and he is given he wins a scholarship to University College, Oxford, in 1916. Now remember what's happening at this time in Europe. Okay, the First World War is just beginning to bubble over. He gets into college and wins a full scholarship to Oxford in 1916. By 1917, he's drafted into the British Army, and he goes and fights in the trenches in the First World War. His experience in the First World War was bitter, horrible, and cruel. He was actually wounded when a shell dropped into the front lines, and 2 of his friends were killed, and he was wounded, and he was sent back to recover in England. So he survived the First World War, but that did not help him with his atheism. It made it worse. And so he said that his atheism was based in the sadness of his mother's death, the bullying he experienced at school, and his experience in the First World War. So he comes out of that as a young man, basically embittered towards God. And one of the more humorous things he says in Surprised by Joy, he says, "I was angry at God for not existing, and I was also angry at God for making the world the way he did." So his atheism was a pretty shallow schoolboy kind of atheism, and very much an emotional reaction, of course, against the hardship that he suffered in losing his mother, being bullied at school, seeing his friends being killed in World War I. And if you read any of the accounts of World War I, it was the most brutal war that the world had ever seen up to that point. So he returns back to England. He recovers from his wounds in the First World War, and he continues his education at Oxford. He earns first-class degrees in 3 different subjects. So basically, he had a triple major, and he won, sort of, in our equivalent would be graduated summa cum laude in all 3. Okay, his accomplishment at Oxford has never been equaled, as I understand. In other words, his accomplishment academically as an undergraduate was so advanced, and so he emerged as one of the brightest minds of his generation. Still an atheist, and now he's awarded a professorship of English at Oxford. So now he's actually what they call a don, or a professor at Oxford. While he was in the trenches in World War I, he had a friend named Paddy Moore. And Paddy and he were roommates and good friends, and they promised each other that if one of them should die in the war, that the other one, if the other one survived, they would look after their friend's family. Paddy died. And so C.S. Lewis comes back to England with the promise that he made to his friend that he would look after his family. And Paddy had a mother and a sister. And so C.S. Lewis was kind of adopted by Mrs. Moore and Maureen, Paddy's sister, and moved in with them. So now he's living in Oxford as a don, as a professor, developing his academic career. And also, every day at the end of class, he's going home to Mrs. Moore and Maureen, a kind of adopted family. Remember, his father's in Northern Ireland. His father is distant and emotionally cut off. His mother's dead. So C.S. Lewis, as a young man coming out of the trauma of the war, is basically a very wounded person emotionally as well as physically. And he settles in with Mrs. Moore and Maureen and he's sort of adopted by them. Now, the relationship he had with Mrs. Moore is a matter of controversy amongst his biographers. She was, I think, maybe about 20 years older than he was. He referred to her as mother and lived there with her and with Maureen very much as a son in their household. The story is told of how she was also very domineering as a woman. She treated him not only as a son, but as a servant. So after he was teaching at a very high level in Oxford, he would go home to do the house cleaning. And on the way back, he would stop and do the shopping. And he would very much looking after Maureen and Mrs. Moore. Some of his biographers have asked whether he actually had an intimate relationship with Mrs. Moore or not. And I think the question is open on that. Maureen, in later years, they had separate bedrooms, but Maureen, the daughter, in later years explained that the bedrooms, while they were separate, had an adjoining door between them. And so some of the biographers think that he actually had an intimate relationship with Mrs. Moore. Others say no, he was a son in the household. In any case, he honors his promise to Paddy and stays living with Maureen and Mrs. Moore and looks after them until she finally gets older, begins to suffer from dementia, goes into a nursing home, and C.S. Lewis goes and visits her every day in the nursing home, being faithful to her in that way. If you remember the story of T.S. Eliot, remember T.S. Eliot also comes to England, is estranged from his family, is a vulnerable young man during World War I, and remember he marries Vivian and gets into a very bad relationship. Well, I think C.S. Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore was probably a little bit like T.S. Eliot's relationship with Vivian. It was an unhealthy relationship, a relationship which was not what a man in his early 20s should be going into. But he continued, and he was faithful to Mrs. Moore, looking after her in a similar way that T.S. Eliot tried to do the best he could for Vivian, even though she was obviously insane and imbalanced emotionally, if you remember that whole drama and story that we talked about with T.S. Eliot. So I've always seen these two as actually kind of being partners in crime. The book of essays about the Inklings that I've got was called Reluctant Allies, with a picture of C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot on the front, because both of them we'll see, eventually came together as allies in the Christian cause. And although they both remained Anglicans and did not become Catholics, they both, I think, if they were alive today, of course, would be Catholics. I'll talk next time a little bit further about the relationship between T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis, because it's very interesting. But we'll go back to C.S. Lewis in Oxford in the late 1920s. By this time, he is a professor at Oxford. And in 1926, he meets J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, there's an amusing bit, again, in Surprised by Joy, where he says, as I was growing up, my father said, the one person I should never trust is a papist, a Catholic. And when I came to university, everyone said in the English department, the one person I should never trust was a philologist. Now, a philologist is a professor of languages, okay? And C.S. Lewis says, I met Tolkien, and he was both. Okay, he was a Catholic and a philologist. They become very good friends, and it's partially through Tolkien's influence that in 1929, C.S. Lewis finally accepts the existence of God. The other great influence to bring him to the point of theism, and theism, of course, is belief in God, not necessarily Christianity, okay? He had come to the point where he'd left atheism and he's believing in God in 1929, and not only Tolkien's influence, but also the influence of G.K. Chesterton. He's reading G.K. Chesterton, especially Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, and that helps him to be convinced about theism. And again, in Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis says about reading Chesterton, he says, I was a young atheist, he said, and I read Chesterton, and I'd like to warn all young atheists, you can't be too careful about who you read. Okay, because Chesterton's brilliance and his wit and his learning appealed to C.S. Lewis's inquisitive mind, and so it was G.K. Chesterton and Tolkien who were the largest influences on bringing him to the point of theism. This is 1929. If you remember the T.S. Eliot story, it was 1927 that T.S. Eliot was baptized. So they're coming into the Christian faith just about the same time. By 1931, C.S. Lewis has accepted Christianity. And again, he describes it in Surprised by Joy when he says that when he accepted theism, it was in his rooms in Oxford. When you go to Oxford and visit Magdalen College, by the way, you can still see, if you walk through and know where to look, you can see which were the rooms of C.S. Lewis's. A don in those days would have what they called rooms, which would be basically a suite of rooms where they would have a study, and they would have a place to sleep if they wanted to stay overnight, and also a kind of sitting room where they would have the students come in for tutorials. The way the education works in Oxford is that students don't go to classes and take exams with computerized answer sheets and stuff like that, okay? They go to tutorials, and a tutorial is a small group of students, maybe half a dozen students studying a particular subject with a particular professor. And this is the form of education I had when I went to seminary in Oxford. So we would go, let's say we're studying New Testament. One of the professors in the college would be a New Testament professor. He would meet with 6 or 7 students. He would give us books to read and an essay topic to write. We would go away and write an essay, and then we would come back the next week and we would read the essays, and we would critique the essays amongst us, and then he would critique the essays with us and give us some more books to read for the next couple of weeks to write some more essays. These essays were of varying quality, as you can imagine. I can remember one of my classmates, for instance, was not very academic, but he was a very creative writer. So he didn't really enjoy reading all the books on New Testament criticism and Greek textual criticism and all the stuff we had to do. But he would turn up for his lectures, and he'd begin reading and saying, imagine, if you will, a caravan of camels trending their way across the desert sands. And he would load it up with all this flowery language, but with very little content to it. But it was very entertaining. So the tutor would then instruct the students and teach the students and pick them up on what they're writing. And so C.S. Lewis would have been in his rooms having various students come in on this tutorial basis. And the tutorials are then supplemented by lectures. And the professors are responsible not only for guiding their students through the tutorials, but they also give public lectures. So on their particular topic. So C.S. Lewis was an expert in Renaissance literature, and he would therefore not only have his students in tutorials, but he would also therefore go to what was one of the buildings which was called the schools, where they have big lecture halls, and he would therefore lecture on his subject to anybody. And they're called public lectures because anybody could attend them, even the public, as well as students. And so, for instance, in addition to the New Testament studies I would be doing with my tutor, we would cycle across town to attend the lectures of an eminent New Testament scholar who was on the staff of Oxford University. And we would be there with a whole classroom full of other theology students from all the different theology colleges and all the different colleges in the university. So that's how the education functions then. And then at the end of the year, you would go to take exams in those particular subjects. And the exams were written exams. So you would go in and sit down at a desk, and you'd have a little booklet in front of you which had the exam questions in them. And the moderator of the exams would ring a little bell, and you then begin to write your essay with a set period of time based on the exam questions that you're given, which you don't have in advance. So you go in having to know your subject and sit there and write an essay on that particular subject. If you're a good writer, it's a wonderful way to do your exams. If you're not so good a writer, you probably would prefer multiple choice. Okay, but it's an exciting and demanding way to be educated, and relies very heavily on your writing skills and your independent study skills. So C.S. Lewis is a professor of English. He's also producing various academic works on his subject of Renaissance literature, and working hard with his tutorial students and with his lecturing. People said he was a fantastically interesting lecturer, and his lecture halls would always be absolutely crammed with everybody wanting to go and hear him lecture. So he was a riveting and a fascinating lecturer. J.R.R. Tolkien, not so much. Apparently J.R.R. Tolkien used to mumble and didn't like lecturing publicly, and people would not be able to understand him. But C.S. Lewis was brilliant. So in 1931, C.S. Lewis finally makes his step to be converted not just to theism, but also to Christianity. And he says, again, he'd been going through and thinking it all through, and there were a couple of key events which happened which helped him to make the shift over from just theism to actually being a committed Christian. One of those was an offhand comment as he was walking through the common room. Now the common room in Oxford College is basically like a big comfortable gentleman's living room where everybody's got a leather chair to sit in and newspapers to read and books to read. And one of the professors there was reading a recent study of archaeology in the Holy Land. And he made an offhand comment, which C.S. Lewis overheard. And this professor, who was an atheist, said, "All that stuff about the dying and rising God," he said, "looks like it might really have happened." In other words, he was skeptical about his skepticism. And he was reading about the archaeology of the Holy Land and saying, well, maybe this thing actually happened, which is recounted in the Gospels. This little offhand comment, which C.S. Lewis overheard, lodged in his mind, and he kept on thinking about this. Finally, and I didn't write down the absolute date, but it was in 1931, after a dinner in college, he goes on has a very important conversation with Tolkien and with one of their friends called Hugo Dyson. And after dinner, they go for a walk in Addison's Walk. Addison's Walk is a wooded pathway just adjacent to Magdalen College, which runs by the river there in Oxford. And if you go to Oxford, you can actually go around and walk around Addison's Walk and see where they're walking. It's a circular walk in a wooded area, and they were walking around this wooded area, and they were talking about myth. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his boyhood days, was very attracted to Norse myth and Greek myth. He was captivated by these stories, and he was caught up in these stories, and he felt a sense of joy and a sense of uplift and a sense of belief, a sense in something that was there in these stories that he didn't have anywhere else. He could glimpse the transcendent through these stories and these myths. And Tolkien, of course, shared the love of Norse myth with C.S. Lewis. That's one of the things which he says in surprised by joy that he knew Tolkien would be his friend, because this was something which they both shared with nobody, which nobody else liked. And so they were very fond of myth, and Greek myth and Norse myth. And so in this conversation at Addison's Walk, Dyson and Tolkien and Lewis are talking about the way myth works. So I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about myth so that you can put this into context. When we talk about the word myth, most people, when they hear the word myth, simply think it means a fanciful story that somebody made up, which in scientific and historical terms is pretty much worthless. Okay? Most people think of myth as being a fanciful story which somebody has made up. And so in common language, you'll hear people say, oh, that's just a myth, right? Oh, that's just a myth. We know now that such and such is a myth. In other words, it's an untrue story. However, myth should not be thrown out as simply an untrue story or a fanciful story that somebody made up. Myth is a very powerful literary concept, which I'd like to just discuss for a few minutes. So, to understand myth, we really need to understand different categories of stories. And one of the categories of stories that we put it this way, different categories of meaningful stories, okay? And so the first category you might consider would be a fable. A fable is a meaningful story which is probably not factual, but it might have elements of truth to it. And it has a moral at the end. And the moral is a very simple moral which can be stated clearly at the end of the story. So an example of a fable, Aesop's fables, for instance, an example of a fable is, of course, the tortoise and the story of the tortoise and the hare. Okay? We all know the story of the tortoise and the hare. It's a beautiful fable. And at the end you can say the meaning of the fable, the moral of the fable is never give up. Okay? Or the moral of the fable is the little guy will win in the end. Okay? Or the moral of the fable is appearances are deceiving. Okay? The hare seems to be the quick guy, the tortoise wins in the end. So a fable is a story which has a clear moral at the end. An allegory is a story which has a one-on-one connection with the characters or the events in the story, which gives it its meaning. So the greatest example of an allegory in English, of course, is the Pilgrim's Progress. So in Pilgrim's Progress, the pilgrim is a pilgrim who is making his journey through this barren land. Mr. Worldly Wise Man represents what? Worldly wisdom, okay? And he behaves in a way which shows us what worldly wisdom is. So an allegory has a one-on-one, clearly defined identification with a person or an event in the story with the meaning, which gives it its meaning. A parable, which our Lord tells, is actually a bit more subtle than either a fable or an allegory. Jesus tells parables which have meaning, but sometimes they're allegorical, and you can see a one-on-one meaning, like the parable of the sower, when he says the seeds are this, and the weeds are that, and the birds are this, and they have a one-on-one meaning. But very often the parable is much more, the meaning is much more incarnated in the story. So we participate and understand the story in a deep way with our hearts, and that's where the meaning is. So for instance, the parable of the prodigal son is not an allegory, okay? It's a parable which teaches us deep truths about fathers and sons and faith and repentance and human psychology. And so a parable is sometimes like an allegory, but the best parables are actually deeper than that and more subtle than that. So we have a fable, we have an allegory, we have a parable, and then we come to myth. And myth is a story, either factual or unfactual, which communicates this meaning that I'm trying to communicate about a parable, but in a much more comprehensive and much deeper way. Okay, a myth will actually get us to identify with the hero in the story and go through, as they go through a journey, we identify with them and we identify with their emotions and we identify with their ups and their downs, and we experience the story in what's called a mythic way. And a myth, therefore, is the most powerful of these kind of stories. Now, when we talk about the Chronicles of Narnia in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to discuss about whether they are allegory, myth, parable, or fable. And we'll see that there's a little bit of all that mixed up together. But for tonight, just to talk about myth, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are very fascinated with myth and the way myth functions. Now, this is operating, remember, now in the 1920s and 1930s, myth was a hot topic in academic circles in the first half of the 20th century. This is for some complicated reasons. Well, basically, archaeology and anthropology. Archaeology, the study of ancient ruins, and anthropology, the study of human culture, were new sciences at the beginning of the 20th century. Academics were traveling out around the world and discovering a lot about different cultures and about different ancient cultures. Therefore, part of the study of anthropology and archaeology, which was going on, was also the study of mythology. And so in Oxford and in Cambridge and various other academic centers in Europe, the study of mythology was a hot topic. So C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien in the 1920s are actually part of a trend, academic trend at the time, of studying myth and learning about myth in all sorts of different cultures. And these myths were not just in Norse myths and Greek myths, but the mythologists were studying myths from Native American cultures and South American cultures and Far Eastern cultures and African cultures, and gathering these myths together to see how they actually work within human culture. And one of the things they notice is that myth very often is linked with the religious practice of a particular people. That the stories of the myths are very often linked in with the gods and goddesses. And therefore, myth is also goes hand in hand with a lot of primitive religious practices. Now, because of this, most of the myths that they were studying were kind of creation myths and myths with gods and goddesses, which we knew were not factual. Okay, they didn't really happen. There were stories that came up out of the culture and out of the history of the people, but nobody pretended that they actually happened to real people in history at a place in time. And one of the myths which comes up over and over again is the myth of the dying and the rising God. The myth of the dying and the rising God is there in Egypt. It's there in the Syrian and the Sumerian cultures in the Middle East. It's there in African cultures. It's there in most cultures, the idea of a great hero who actually dies and rises again. And this is one of the themes which recurs. And this is one of the things which fascinated people about the study of myth. That so often you had similar themes, similar types of characters, similar types of stories which are occurring in Africa, in Asia, in the Far East, in ancient Europe, in North America, in primitive tribes. The same kind of themes keep cropping up over and over again. And this was fascinating to mythologists and fascinating to Tolkien and to Lewis as well. However, while most of these ancient myths were non-factual, I believe it's also possible to have a myth which is true. Let me give you an example of one. My grandfather, my mother's father, died in Christmas of 1941, maybe? Just before the First World War. He was walking to market where my mom and my grandmother were working in a baked goods stall, and he was walking with his two sons, aged 10 and 12, on a winter day in Pennsylvania. And as they were walking along the road was icy because it had snowed the night before. A coal truck went around the corner and lost control and began to slide towards the two boys, which were walking in front of my grandfather. He leapt in front of the coal truck and pushed the boys to safety, but the coal truck crushed him against the guardrail. And so people took him to the hospital, and in hospital, they folded him into the back seat of a car. This is before they had body boards and ambulances that could come and emergency services. They put him in the back seat of a car. His splintered ribs punctured his internal organs, and he died with my grandmother there by his bedside. And just before he died, he looked up in the corner of the room and he said, "Can't you see them, Esther? They're so beautiful." So this story comes down to our family as a beautiful story which carries lots of meaning. A man of faith, a man who gives his life for his sons, an act of heroism, a belief in the afterlife and seeing the angels, the love of his wife and family who continue to tell this story of heroism. So By the time it comes down to my generation, and I'm telling the story to my children, this story has assumed a kind of mythic character, okay? We identify with the story, we identify with what has happened. Whenever I tell this story, people get a bit emotional because emotions are one of the things which helps myth to really work. And so we tell stories that operate in a mythic way, and that story works in a mythic way, and it's a true story. So we would say it's a true myth. But a lot of the myths which were told in cultures, of course, were not true factually or historically. I say all that to say this is why that conversation in Addison's Walk in Oxford with C.S. Lewis and Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien in 1931 is so important. Because that conversation, that word that C.S. Lewis had overheard in the common room by that atheist professor was stuck in his mind. And he tells the story in Surprised by Joy when he says, so Tolkien helped me to see that the Christian myth, the myth in the Gospels, was worked on us just like all the other myths, except that it really happened. Okay, so if you hear people talking about the myth of Christianity, don't necessarily assume that they're saying, oh, that's a myth like Thor and Jupiter and so forth, and it's not true. Sometimes theologians will use the term myth, referring to Christianity, speaking about trying to get across the way that the gospel actually works on us, the way we actually identify with the gospel. Now, it's very interesting that in the ancient world, the myths were very often reenacted in the theater of the ancient world, and they were often reenacted in the rituals of the religion of the ancient world. And isn't that what we do during Holy Week? Okay. We come together and we live out and we relive and reenact in a liturgical, ritualistic way the gospel story, which works on us in a mythic way. And remember, I'm not saying myth is untrue or unfactual, unhistorical, just the opposite. I'm saying with C.S. Lewis, the Christian story is a true myth. It's a myth that works on us just like all the other myths, except that it really happened. Okay? And he came to see, therefore, also, and Tolkien would have helped him with this, came to see that within the Catholic experience of the liturgy, not just Holy Week, but in the regular liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Mass, we are also participating in the story in a mythic way. We're called to actually participate with our hearts and our minds and join ourselves in with the story in a way which is difficult to describe. My words are failing me here. But people know in a gut level what this actually means. The importance of myth, therefore, for storytelling is very powerful. And so the work of the mythologists in the first half of the 20th century have influenced an awful lot of novelists and playwrights and screenwriters who've actually, therefore, woven this same idea into their writing of stories. George Lucas, for instance, who developed Star Wars, was very influenced by the theories of myth in developing the Star Wars story. The prequels and the sequels, not so much. But the first three, very much so. And Tolkien, of course, understood this deeply, and his working and reworking of Lord of the Rings, which Joseph will deal with in the last 3 weeks, will help you to see what he was trying to do. Tolkien actually said he wanted to create a myth for the English-speaking people because he was interested in Norse myth and Celtic myth, but he said the English people don't have a myth. So he wanted to create one. I think he did a good job. So because of this conversation with Hugo Dyson and Tolkien, Lewis comes out the other side as a Christian and a committed Christian. He joined the Anglican Church and remained a member of the Church of England for his entire life, although the older he got, the more Catholic he became in his expression of Catholicism, of Anglicanism. In 1941 and 43, England by now is getting involved in the Second World War, and Lewis is in his early 40s, and he volunteers, and the War Department says, "You're too old, but you're a good writer. Would you consider joining the team of people who are writing propaganda in German for the Germans?" And Lewis, by this time a Christian, says, "No, I don't really fancy writing lies. because he knew that propaganda was mostly lies that he would have to be telling to the German people. So one of the army chaplains drafts him instead to come and do talks on Christianity to servicemen. And so he begins doing some talks, going around and giving talks to the servicemen about the basics of Christianity. He's then commissioned by the BBC to do this on the radio, and thus comes about what his famous broadcast talks. And these are still, actually, the recordings of these are still available, and you can listen to them online if you like. You can hear C.S. Lewis give these talks about Christianity. He then puts the broadcast talks together into 3 different volumes, which eventually is put together and edited down to become his famous book, Mere Christianity. So we're talking today about his Apologetics, his defense of the Christian faith, and his big major book on this is, of course, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity defends the core of the shared Christian faith. That's why he calls it Mere Christianity. He's not trying to defend Anglicanism or Catholicism or Methodism or being the Baptist religion or anything. He wants to defend the core beliefs which all Christians actually believe in. Mere Christianity. He wants to defend that which would appeal to all Christians, and to also appeal to an awful lot of people who were nominal Christians in England of his day. So in England in the 1940s, everybody would have been Anglican. Okay, we used to joke when I was an Anglican that C of E, Church of England, actually meant Church of Everybody. Okay, because everybody would have been baptized and would have been at least a nominal Christian. And C.S. Lewis is concerned in his broadcast talks and in Mere Christianity to try to help ordinary Christians understand the basics of their faith. That's why it's such a popular book and remains in print today and has sold so many copies over the years. I want to take a few moments also to put this into context, because C.S. Lewis in the mid-20th century is defending the Christian faith at a time when the Christian faith is under huge attack. I've outlined this in my book, Beheading Hydra, to look at the different isms that took place in the last 500 years. In the last 500 years, Christianity has come under huge attack, and I need to put it into context by explaining what it was like before. Before the 16th century, all humanity, basically, generally speaking, believed in the transcendent realm, the invisible realm, the spiritual realm, which actually connected with the physical material realm. Okay, and the way you connected with the gods, the way you connected with the spiritual, the way you connected with the transcendent was actually through the physical. The ancient religions all had things like sacrifices and libations and offerings to gods and goddesses and so forth, because they believed that the physical was the way to connect with the transcendent. This was perfected by the Catholic faith, with the incarnation, which we say God himself comes down and takes human form. And it's perpetuated in the Catholic sacramental system. So the thing which distinguishes Catholics from other Christians and from other religions is we actually believe that God connects with us and God's grace comes to us through physical means, through water, through bread, through wine, through oil, through the laying on of hands. And we still believe this today. Up until the 16th century, everybody believed it, in one way or another, believed that the transcendent realm was real and that was connected with the physical realm and the material realm, and religion was the way that you made that connection. In the 16th century, the Protestant Revolution takes place, and the core element, the essential element of the Protestant Revolution is that bond between the transcendent and the physical is broken. Now, the Protestants teach that the sacraments don't actually communicate grace. Instead, they're symbols. They're mere symbols. And once that break happens between the transcendental and the material realms, for the next 500 years, it goes downhill fast. So in the 16th century, you have the Protestant Revolution, which breaks the bond between the physical and the transcendent. In the 17th century, the rise of science, because think it through. If the transcendent and the physical are broken, then you can study the material realm independently of the transcendent realm. And thus is the rise of science and technology, which brought us many good benefits. But the earlier understanding of science in the Middle Ages was that it was God's creation and God worked through the material realm. Now that's broken. You can not only study the material realm on its own, but you can also begin to use it. You can begin to abuse it because it has no real meaning, okay? Because it's cut off from the source of meaning. After the 17th century, we come into the 18th century, which is the so-called Enlightenment. And the key phrase there, is, of course, is Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am." Now, it's not the physical realm which is the source of reality. It's my mind. My mind is the only source of reality. My mind is the only source of meaning. And this is therefore cut off from God, cut off from the transcendent, and it's just the human mind. However, humanity isn't very happy with that. So in the 18th century, it's only my mind which is the source of reality. In the 19th century, the Romantics come along and say, you know, it's not the mind, it's the heart. It's your feelings, it's your emotions, it's the beating heart of love and passion which really gives you meaning and which really connects you with the transcendent. You see the sense of logic? Okay, now we're into the 20th century, and the 20th century is saying, if it's only your emotions, then it's not just your emotions, it's also your sexual instincts. You must respect those. That's where your real meaning is. So it gets us where we are today, where your identity is determined by your sexual desire. This process over 500 years was in the midstream in the mid-20th century when Lewis and the rest of the academics in Europe are struggling with all these concepts and ideas. And also, this has thrown them into, it's another whole discussion of how all this process threw us into 2 world wars in the 20th century, which C.S. Lewis is involved in as a soldier in the First World War and as a propagandist in the Second World War. So Lewis is trying to defend that old-fashioned understanding of the world. Remember, he's an expert in medieval and Renaissance literature. He understands intimately the medieval mindset in which the transcendent and the physical was still linked. And so Lewis is trying to defend that basically Catholic understanding of the world in which the transcendent and the physical are actually linked. Still with me here? This is why we say C.S. Lewis is essentially a Catholic writer. He never became a Catholic, but what he was communicating was an essentially Catholic, medieval understanding, traditional understanding of the world and of the Christian faith. So he is trying to communicate, therefore, to ordinary people the reality of God's existence and the reality of God connecting with our historical, physical realm. And he does this not only with his book Mere Christianity, but with his other 2 major apologetics works, which are his book Miracles and his book The Problem of Pain. I'm going to see if I can get this going now. And in Miracles and Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis is trying to approach 2 of the major problems that modern man has with faith. First of all, miracles, the supernatural, nah. He wants to go back and defend miracles in the face of that. The other big question of modern man is the question he had as a young man: if there is a God, why so much suffering? In other words, the problem of pain. And so Lewis has these 2 major works. In Mere Christianity, one of the major themes he tries to defend is the incarnation of our Lord. And he does this with this famous quote of his, which is called Lewis's trilemma. You know, a dilemma is a tough choice between 2 choices. A trilemma is Lewis's tough choice between 3 choices. So I'll read this to you. He says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, that is Jesus. I'm ready to accept, that is, they might say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So this is the kind of crisp, clear, hard-hitting writing of C.S. Lewis. So it's quite a famous bit from Mere Christianity. That Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord, which is a good way of and you know I like 3 words that begin with the same letter. So all through Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis is got the same hard-hitting defense of a traditional, historical Christian faith. The other thing he tried to do in defending belief in God was he began with a shared starting point of all humanity, which is an understanding of moral good and moral evil. So again, here's a quote where he says, "I have met people who exaggerate the differences between different kinds of moralities because they have not distinguished between differences of morality and differences of belief about facts. For example, one man said to me, 300 years ago people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct?" Because C.S. Lewis has been trying to say all humanity understands what goodness is and what evil is. We have a basic understanding of good and evil, and from that he builds his case for the existence of God. But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There's no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. So this is the kind of wit and the kind of clear thinking that he brings all the time in his work. So I can recommend him to you. Finally, the last thing Lewis stands against is the kind of religion which modernism had brought about. So by the middle of the 20th century, an awful lot of Christian writers and theologians were basically saying about the supernatural dimension of the faith, you know, all of that is a myth, meaning a myth that wasn't true. A myth which was just a made-up fanciful story. All that about the supernatural, nah. We have to remove that stuff from Christianity to make Christianity acceptable for modern people. A typical example will be, for instance, about the resurrection. You know, a modernist would say, the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead. What this means, of course, is that the beautiful teachings of Jesus continued to be believed by his followers even after his tragic death. You might hear this very often with the feeding of the 5,000. The beautiful thing about the feeding of the 5,000 was not some sort of magic that Jesus did, instead that everybody shared their lunch. Okay, this is the kind of modernism and reinterpretation of the faith which C.S. Lewis hated. Okay, he called it watered down Christianity. Okay, and when we talk about the Chronicles of Narnia, we'll see that he created a particular character which was not a tame lion. Okay, because he really believed in this full-blooded, supernatural, historical Christian faith, which he sought to defend time and time again in his apologetical writings. And that particular battle which he was trying to fight is one which is going on today, and one which I'm afraid has been lost in many Christian churches. So when you see a Christian faith which is reduced to no more than doing good, no more than feeding the hungry, no more than bringing peace and justice in the world, no more than saving the rainforest, no more than being nice people, it ain't Christianity. It's something else. And C.S. Lewis would say against that sort of religion, it's not actually Christianity. And I would go further and say, not only is it not Christianity, it's not actually religion. Okay? Religion has always dealt with the interface between the physical world and the spiritual world. It's always been the meeting place where people went and met the gods and goddesses. It's the place where they went and they met the life after death. It's the place where they dealt with supernatural realities. That's what religion is. And if it's reduced simply to being nice people and respectable people and do-gooders, well, that's not something that people would die for. And C.S. Lewis stands up firmly against this in all of his writings and in all of his faith. And that's why we claim him as a Catholic writer, because this is the full-blooded Catholic faith. Now, I need to move on here and finish because we're coming to the end of our time. I'd just like to say a word about the legacy of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, writing in the middle of the 20th century, actually does a huge service to the cause of the church. And here's why. In the face of modernism, Christians reacted in two different ways. Well, three different ways. First of all, the Catholics took refuge in what I call ultramontanism, which is the Pope said it, therefore it's true, and we believe it. And they took refuge in traditional devotions and refuge in the traditional faith, putting on blinders to modernism. Kind of like, we don't buy that modernism stuff, that's good. We just buy traditional Catholicism and loyalty to the Pope and the teaching of the Church. The Protestants, on the other hand, took refuge in fundamentalism. And fundamentalism was saying, we have the Bible, every single word of the Bible is literally, historically true. That's our defense against modernism. So the Protestants take refuge in fundamentalism, the Catholics take refuge in ultramontanism, which is a very traditional trust in Catholicism and traditional Catholicism. And that's all well and good as far as it goes, but it's not actually dealing with the modernist threat and the modernist teaching. C.S. Lewis comes along, and he doesn't so much attack modernism, he mocks it a fair bit. He doesn't so much attack modernism as puts forward a positive, intellectual, smart, well-reasoned defense of theism and the Christian faith. In other words, he builds in a positive way in his apologetics, not in a destructive way. And so he teaches all of us who are engaged in apologetics, don't get involved in negative arguments, build a positive argument, build a positive life, make it attractive. And that's what C.S. Lewis does. And he's done a great service, therefore, to all of us who are Christians now, 100 years later, and also to the legacy of Christianity in all the different denominations. So that's his legacy as in apologetics, and I'd like to just put up a few details here on some suggested reading for you. Lewis the Apologist, like I mentioned, the three main books for him are Mere Christianity, Miracles, and the Problem of Pain. These are all in print. You can find them on Amazon. You can probably find them on Amazon in paperback versions, secondhand for a couple of dollars. Okay. God in the Dock is a big collection of his essays, which were collected by his posthumous editor, Walter Hooper. These are excellent. They're short, they're readable, and they basically echo his major works of apologetics. So God in the Dock, and you'll find a lot of these essays actually online. So you can read them on your computer if you like. Remember, these books will also be available, in a lot of them in audible form now, in audio form, as well as in ebooks. Next week, we're going to talk about his science fiction, his three science fiction books. But if you want to get a taste of his imagination and his vivid imagination, how it ties in with his faith, the best book to read is The Great Divorce. Okay, The Great Divorce is very readable, it's very short. It's not science fiction, but it is fantasy. And it's the one which most clearly shows his interaction between his faith and his fiction. We'll talk in more detail about the three science fiction books next week. And then in the third week, we're going to talk about the Chronicles of Narnia, for which he's most famous. If you would like some inspiration, one of his sermons is online. It's called The Weight of Glory. It's a wonderful inspirational text. He preached that actually during the war, in the Second World War, in the University Church in Oxford, to a group of students. There's a wonderful website, cslewis.com, which he set up before he died. Not really. He died in 1963, remember. Okay, but cslewis.com has links to all of his books. It has links to lots of his essays. And also, Hillsdale College are offering a free course at the moment, a free online course, which is an introduction to C.S. Lewis. If you want to dig a bit more deeply, this course is being taught by a friend of mine, Father Michael Ward. Michael Ward is a priest in the Anglican Ordinariate in England. Okay, so he was an Anglican priest. He's now a Catholic in the Ordinariate. He's also one of the foremost Lewis scholars of the new generation. So most of the scholars of Lewis's time now have passed away. Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's secretary and editor, passed away, I think, about 5-6 years ago. I got to meet him a couple of times when I was in Oxford. And Michael Ward is a friend of mine and Joseph's, who's actually working as a teacher in Oxford, and he is a Catholic priest who's written some books on Lewis, and he teaches the course at Hillsdale, this online course at Hillsdale, which is free. So if you're interested, there's the website for you. Or you can, if you don't want down the whole URL link, you can go to Hillsdale College and look for Introduction to C.S. Lewis.